We know from the 2016 election as well as the 2020 election just how important that power to replace or fill, I should say, an open seat is for a president. One might look, for example, at the tenure of Justice Clarence Thomas and question whether he might be considering retirement in the event of a Trump victory. If that were to be the case, then his replacement would no doubt be decades younger, and such a replacement would cement the control that more conservative justices currently have on the Supreme Court and cement that control for decades to come. The court right now has a huge attention for revisiting major decisions that were decided under a different approach to constitutional interpretation. For example, we could expect more decisions in the vein of the Dobbs decision overruling Roe versus Wade, the Harvard decision overruling, for the most part, all decisions upholding affirmative action. We could expect a lot more decisions by the Supreme Court with a focus on how the legislative process unfolds and reining in the administrative state. That is to say, more decisions like last term's Loper-Bright that overruled the Chevron doctrine, a doctrine that allowed administrative agencies to pass a range of regulations based on their own interpretation of statutory directives. The makeup of the court influences the cases the court chooses to hear, and then how those cases are ultimately resolved. So again, elections matter, and this is counterintuitive to many Americans. They don't tend to think about the Supreme Court as the first reason to vote for one president or another. But the reality is, the future of the Supreme Court is inextricably linked to the election of a presidential administration. First, what we see is a court that is deciding far fewer cases than even just 10, 15 years ago. Particularly one recent term, the Supreme Court decided fewer cases than it had in any term unless you go all the way back to the Reconstruction period. That being said, this is a Supreme Court that is deciding one blockbuster case after another. And what is particularly noteworthy about those cases is that increasingly they have to do with issues that all Americans engage with, whether it's abortion and reproductive rights, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's guns and the regulation thereof. The Supreme Court in the last few years has decided a number of blockbuster cases on these issues and countless more, including reining in its view, the administrative state. All of this has huge ramifications for the daily lives of all Americans. The Supreme Court today is in somewhat of a precarious position. There's no escaping the fact that public approval of the court is arguably at an all-time low. The court needs to be very concerned about these developments and mindful of how its actions are connected to public approval of it as an institution. This is because the court's role in the separation of powers is enormously important. And it is, to that end, extremely important that the American public believe the court is an impartial institution. As Alexander Hamilton wrote generations ago, the courts have neither force nor will, only judgment. And that means that our grand constitutional experiment only works if the court's judgments are respected, not just by the president and Congress, but by all Americans.